Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Statistics Solutions webinar today. My name is Justin D'Souza. I'm a quantitative specialist here at the company. Today, we're going to discuss how to construct quantitative research questions and hypotheses. My colleague Sierra is putting some hyperlinks in the chat box for scheduling free consultations and dissertation resources. If you have any questions, you can schedule a free consultation with us. You can also type your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box. And at the end of the webinar, I will be doing a Q&A session. And we'll send everyone a copy of the webinar as well as a copy of the PowerPoint. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'll give a brief overview of the services that we provide at Statistics Solutions. Then we'll dive into today's topic about constructing research questions, primarily quantitative questions. Then we'll conclude with a summary and a Q&A session. Here you can see all the different components of the dissertation that we assist with, starting with topic development, going all the way to final defense and journal publications. So at our company, we have quantitative and qualitative specialists, as well as literature review specialists. So depending on what chapter you're working on and where you need assistance, you could receive one or two specialists. If you're doing a mixed method study, you will receive all three, a qual person and a lit review person. And we can help you frame your research questions, identify a gap in the literature, help you pinpoint your theoretical framework, figure out what is the best analysis you need to use to address your questions. So we're dissertation editors, not dissertation writers. So we'll take your draft and then we will make edits to your draft. The results chapter is something that we do in its entirety. So you just send us your data set and we will crunch your numbers in SPSS and we will present an APA write-up according to your template. We also help with uploading surveys. We have our own SurveyMonkey account in which we can host a survey for you. If you're using something else like Qualtrics or Amazon mTurk, we can help upload the survey for you on your account. And then we help with the discussion chapter, PowerPoints for proposal and final defenses, and journal publication. So if you have any questions about the services we provide, you can give us a call at 727-442-4290, or you can click one of the hyperlinks that Sierra provided. And on this slide, I have a couple hyperlinks. You can view the past webinars we've done, and you can look at the future webinars that we will be doing. Okay, so when you're developing research questions, which is what we're focusing on today, first, you need to lay the foundation for if you're doing a quantitative or qualitative study. So quantitative data involves collecting numeric data. If you have Likert scale type data, if you're using a self-report survey, it's usually going to be quantitative, whereas qualitative involves conducting interviews, exploring phenomena, understanding the underlying meaning behind a topic or a concept. That's when you do qualitative research. I try not to do both. I would advise anyone who's in this webinar not to do both quantitative and qualitative. It just adds so much time to the process. Select one approach or the other. And in general, I see that quantitative, it goes through a little bit faster than qualitative. Okay, so before developing your research questions, you first need to identify a research problem. What is the gap in the literature? What is your study contributing to the literature that nobody else has done before? So you have to kind of narrow down your, I would say, your chapter 2 or your literature before going into your introduction and maybe your methodology. There has to be an observable problem statement first before you can develop research questions. Okay, then after identifying your research problem, your purpose statement, the gap in the literature, create a list of all the variables of interest. Are these variables going to be numerically measurable? Are you using Likert scale data? Are you collecting test scores? Are you looking at mean, standard deviations, things like that? Oh, am I not sharing my screen? My apologies, everyone. Just saw the chat box. So let me go back a couple slides. That was my mistake. Thought I had shared already. So here I had a list of the services that we provide. Okay, kind of explain that verbally. Then we have a couple slides to look at the past webinars and the future webinars. Then on this slide, we're discussing the difference between quant and qual. And then identifying a research problem before you go into developing research questions. And then once you have your research questions, or you have your idea of a topic in mind, you need to list all your variables of interest. Okay, so are the variables numerically measurable? Are you using Likert scale data? Are you collecting test scores? Are you looking at biological measurements like mass or blood pressure, things like that? Then you need to pinpoint if you're using a self-report survey or are you using archival secondary data? Okay, so a self-report survey generally involves Likert scale type data, strongly agree, strongly disagree. Archival data involves collecting data from a resource that already exists. Okay, I would not recommend using both. I would select one of those approaches because it can be difficult to merge a self-report survey with archival data. So just select one of those approaches. Then you pinpoint your research design. Okay, this comes from your purpose statement generally. Are you looking at a descriptive exploratory type study? Are you looking at correlational relationships? Are you running an experiment or borrowing elements from a true experimental study, quasi-experimental or causal comparative? Or are you collecting data over a period of time? In which you're doing maybe a pre-test and a post-test, or you're doing panel data that's collected every year. Okay, so we'll break each of these down and the types of research questions or hypotheses that go with them. Okay. So first, with the descriptive exploratory design, the idea behind this is that you're not trying to prove or disprove hypotheses. You're looking at trends in a sample. So you don't generally have hypotheses with these. You're just identifying what are the general characteristics in your sample. We have some sample research questions for this. What are the trends in job satisfaction among teaching faculty? What is the predominant leadership style used among managers in a workplace? Questions like these are usually addressed with descriptive statistics, so using things like frequencies and percentages, or means and standard deviations, and bar charts and histograms or pie charts. Many universities are not completely on board with this because it's considered too simplistic, but I would see if it works because it's going to make the process much more efficient. You just have simple quantitative research questions. What makes these descriptive and not correlational or quasi-experimental is that you don't have another variable in here. You're not like looking at the relationship between job satisfaction and leadership style, or job satisfaction and motivation or efficacy. You're just looking at job satisfaction on its own in one question, and then leadership style on its own in a second question. Correlational research. This is an umbrella concept. So usually under the correlational design, you have correlational analyses and you have regression analyses. So correlational analyses are generally two-way associations. You don't necessarily have an independent and dependent variable. You just have two variables of interest. Whereas if you're doing a regression analysis, which implies a predictive approach, you should have independent variables and dependent variables. So we'll discuss the regression approach in the next slide. We'll focus on the correlational analyses on this slide. So as I said, you don't need to have independent, dependent variables for this, or predictor criterion variables. This is generally just looking at, is there a significant association between variable 1 and variable 2? And I put some examples here. Is there a significant relationship between age and self-efficacy? Is there a significant association? I see relationship and association used synonymously for this, between education and jobs position, okay? So the specific analysis approach that you would use for this depends on how your variables are coded. If you have continuous variables, if age was a fill-in-the-blank response and self-efficacy is a composite score from a survey, then you would do a Pearson correlation. So you need to have two continuous variables to run a Pearson correlation. If one of your variables is ordinal, meaning it's not continuous, but there's a natural hierarchy to the question, something like education level, or if you're looking at an individual ordinal item, just one strongly agree to strongly disagree item, that's when you do a Spearman correlation. And then a Chi-square test is if you have two nominal variables. So research question 2, education could be considered ordinal or nominal because it's categorical, high school, associates, bachelor's, master's, PhD. And then job position could also be considered nominal. If you have managers and employees and executives, this would be a nominal variable. So that's when you do a chi-square test, is when you have two categorical factors. Here are sample research questions, the same research questions, but then we have the hypotheses below them. So generally you have a null hypothesis, which is signified with the 0 right here, H0, and then HA is your alternative hypothesis. Most of the time you're trying to disprove your null hypothesis. So you're trying to find statistical evidence that this statement, the null hypothesis, is false. Okay, and you say the null is generally there is not a significant relationship, and then the alternative is there is a significant relationship. Same idea with the second example here. Then we go into the predictive approach, okay? So instead of looking at a two-way association, you can look at a regression or predictive approach or a research question. And for this, you need to have an independent variable and you need to have a dependent variable. The independent variables are generally called predictors, and the dependent variable is called a criterion variable. Here we have some sample research questions. Is there a significant predictive relationship between age and self-efficacy? The variable that's listed last is the dependent variable. Whatever's listed preceding that is going to be your independent variable. Then we have a second example. Does emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment significantly predict academic performance? Here we have multiple independent variables. These are measured from the Maslach burnout inventory, a Likert scale survey, and then seeing how it predicts academic performance. Then the third question here, we have one predictor, GPA, and we have an outcome of passing or failing an exam. Each of these questions, just reading these questions, you can figure out what analysis is best. And similar to the correlation slide, it depends on how your variables are being measured. You do a linear regression if your dependent variable is continuous or interval. If self-efficacy is a composite score from a Likert scale survey, then your dependent variable is going to be continuous. So you're going to run a linear regression for that approach. If you have with the same example, if you have multiple predictors, like in research question 2, we have 3 different predictors, you do a multiple linear regression. So a linear regression, just a linear regression has one predictor. A multiple linear regression has multiple independent variables. A binary logistic regression is used when your outcome is binary or dichotomous. So that would be sample research question 3 here. you're trying to see how a independent variable predicts passing and failing an exam. Passing and failing is dichotomous or binary, so you run a binary logistic regression. If you have a categorical variable that has more than two groups beyond passing and failing, then you do a multinomial logistic regression. If you're trying to predict ethnicity or some other categorical variable, this is kind of a rare scenario. You don't see this too much, but if you have a categorical variable with more than two groups, you do a multinomial logistic. And if you have a ordinal outcome, something like education level potentially, or a single Likert scale response, strongly agree to strongly disagree, this is when you do a ordinal logistic regression. Here we have the sample hypotheses. It's very similar to what we looked at before. There is not a significant predictive relationship, and then there is a significant predictive relationship. The null hypothesis is listed first, followed by the alternative. Then we go into the experimental test family. If you're doing an experimental, a quasi-experimental, or a causal comparative design, the goal of these is typically to look at differences in a variable across groups. For this, you need to have an independent grouping factor, and the dependent variable is essentially the variable you're testing for differences. All of these go hand in hand. To do a true experimental study, there are quite a lot of prerequisites. You need to do random assignment of participants into control or treatment groups. Then you conduct an intervention, and you look at differences between pre-test and post-test. Quasi-experimental designs usually involve, along with causal comparative, they borrow elements of an experimental design. Like you might be looking at differences, but you don't assign people to treatment and control groups. Maybe you're comparing between gender. It's usually a group comparison that is predefined for a quasi-experimental study. So something like gender, you as a researcher have no influence on what gender someone is. You're using data that already exists. Okay, here we have some sample questions for a experimental, quasi-experimental type design. And generally, you're going to put your dependent variable first for this instead of last, like a regression approach. So you're asking, is there a significant difference in your dependent variable between the groups of your independent variable? And here you can see some samples. Is there a significant difference in job satisfaction between treatment and control? Is there a significant difference in self-efficacy based on race? RQ3 is similar to the first one, but we're just adding additional dependent variables. And then the fourth one, all we're doing that's different is we're adding a control variable. Each of these research questions ties directly to the bullet point below for analysis approach. The first question, we only have two groups that we're comparing, treatment and control, and we have one dependent variable of job satisfaction. You would do an independent sample t-test for this. If you have three or more groups, something like race, then you do an ANOVA. If you have multiple dependent variables, then you do a MANOVA. Emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, personal accomplishment. If we are looking for differences in all three of those factors at the same time, based on an independent variable, that's when you do a MANOVA. And then we have the ANCOVA-MANCOVA approach, which is similar to the previous one, but we're just adding an additional factor that we are holding constant. Job satisfaction, maybe gender or age. Sometimes you control for demographics. Okay, then here are the sample questions. And it's very similar as before. There is not a significant difference. There is a significant difference. For the second question we had three dependent variables and we have one independent variable. So I would say make a separate hypothesis for each dependent variable. We did one for emotional exhaustion, we did one for depersonalization, and one for personal accomplishment. So you would test all of these separately. Okay, and the final design type we have is a longitudinal design. There can be an overlap with experimental designs with these. If you're doing a true experimental study, that is in fact longitudinal because you have pre-test and post-test data. The requirement for this is that you have a dependent variable that's measured multiple times. Okay, if you're measuring, student test scores at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year, that is longitudinal. Okay, here we have some sample questions. Is there a significant difference in the dependent variable between time 1 and time 2? Here you can see, is there a significant difference in knowledge between pre-test and post-test of an educational intervention? Then we borrow from the first question and we just add a follow-up. Okay, so you could have 2 points in time, pre-test, post-test, or you could have 3 or more points in time. There's a different analysis to use for that. And then sample question 3, is there a difference in knowledge between time, pre-test and post-test, and by group simultaneously? That's probably the most complicated approach, but that's what you do in a true experimental study. The first question, you would use a dependent or paired sample t-test. You have matched data between pre and post. That's when you do a paired sample t-test. Repeated measures ANOVA is like a dependent or paired sample t-test, but you have 3 or more points in time that you're trying to compare. Baseline or pre-test, post-test, and follow-up. And then a mixed model ANOVA is looking at differences between a variable over time and between groups simultaneously. Okay, here are the sample hypotheses. The first one's very straightforward. There is not a significant difference in knowledge between baseline, post-test, follow-up, and then there is a significant difference. The second one is where you have a true experimental study and you're looking at differences over time and between groups. So you need to branch out separate hypotheses for this. Is there a significant difference over time? Then test for a significant difference between groups. And then the most important examination is the interaction effect. Is there a difference over time and by group simultaneously? So if you're doing a pre-test, post-test, and control treatment, you have to figure that there are 4 groups. You have pre-test treatment, pre-test control, post-test treatment, post-test control. You're testing for differences across those 4 possibilities. That's what this interaction effect is. Okay, in summary, first, pinpoint your literature. Identify a problem statement, figure out a gap in the literature, something that's making your topic unique. Determine if you're doing a quantitative or qualitative study. Try not to do both. Figure out your variables of interest, put it all into one table, identify the level of measurement for each of your variables. Are they nominal, ordinal, or interval? Also list all the possibilities of those variables. What are the scores going to range from for each of them? 0 to 10, is it nominal? Is it a yes or no response? Put that all into one table. I find that to be very helpful. Then figure out if you're going to use a survey or archival data, also called secondary data. Try not to use both approaches. And if you're using a survey, try to use something that is previously validated, as it adds time to the process. You have to validate a new survey with the EFA or CFA. That can add more time to the process. And then select a research design. Okay, so I gave the 4 most common research design approaches. And based on the design and the phrasing of your questions, you can figure out what is the best analysis done to address those questions. Okay, so if we have any questions, you can type them into the chat box. I do see we had a lot of comments about the screen not being shared. I apologize for that. So we'll send you a copy of the recording and you can just fast forward, I guess, the first 5 minutes or so. Do we have any questions? You can type them into the chat box or the Q&A box. And if you have any questions about services, you can email us at info@statisticsolutions.com or give us a call at 727-442-4290. Any questions? You can also raise your hand and we can see how the microphone works. Sometimes it's a little bit laggy if we have a lot of participants. Yeah, we have a question from Juan. Do you recommend only one approach instead of mixed methods while in school? Yeah, I would highly recommend just selecting quantitative or qualitative. Mixed methods means you have to conduct a survey and then you have to interview participants after that. So you're going to have to crunch numbers in SPSS and then use something like NVivo to thematize your interviews. It adds months to the process, in my experience. So I would say just go with a quantitative or qualitative approach. And generally, most committees don't have a quantitative and qualitative expert, usually one or the other. That way, you're going to have positive or strong feedback on one side of the paper for the quantitative approach, but maybe not so much the qualitative, or vice versa. They're usually an expert in one of those approaches, not both. All right, do we have any other questions? All righty, if we don't have any other questions, I hope you all have a great day. We'll send everyone a copy of the recording and come join us for the future webinars. Have a great day and enjoy your weekend.